Today, our lesson will be on the Spanish American War. Not so much the period of war itself, but instead the events and incidents that caused warfare to break out between the United States and Spain. As we go through this lesson, please use the note sheet I have provided you with to record definitions for our vocabulary terms, as well as notes on the content on the graphic organizer side. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to consider our essential question for today. Why did the United States go to war with Spain in 1898? To get us started on this lesson, I'm going to ask you to think about warfare and why countries go to war. Go ahead and take a look at the question being asked to you via Play Post-it and respond directly through the website. What are some reasons that countries go to war with another country? What might countries hope to gain by going to war? When I think of the causes of warfare, I tend to think of three main factors. The first is the desire to gain new resources from each other, such as more land or hard to find goods or materials. The second reason a country might go to war is to expand their influence over other parts of the world. In other words, a country might see an opportunity in going to war with another country because if they win, they could potentially seize control of that country. The third reason a country might go to war is to gain independence from a country that has too much control over them. This reason is similar to the last reason, but in this case, a country is trying to gain their own freedoms and establishing themselves instead of trying to put their already established lifestyle on others. Hopefully, your responses were similar to these three reasons. All three of these factors will play a role in the development of the Spanish American War. As we go through this lesson, see if you can identify when these factors are presenting themselves. In order to understand the causes of the Spanish American War, we must first understand what imperialism is, as it is a major theme of this conflict. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy and military efforts. In other words, it's when one country seizes governmental control over another using the military or through taking advantage of a weak government. Many European countries used policies of imperialism during the late 1800s to seize control over other countries all over the world, especially in Africa. However, in the Spanish-American War, two countries could be considered imperialistic: Spain and the United States. Let's start with Spain. In a normal imperialistic relationship, we can identify two roles: the empire and the colony. The empire is the country that has taken control over another using military or political force, while the colony has been subjected to the empire's control. In this relationship, Spain acted as an empire and Cuba acted as the colony. This means that Spain had control over Cuba politically despite the continued dissatisfaction of the Cuban people. For review, I'd like you now to respond to the following prompt directly through Play Post-it. What's the relationship between Spain and Cuba? Which is the empire? Which is the colony? In your response, you should have mentioned that Spain and Cuba were members of an imperialistic relationship and that Spain acted as an empire while Cuba acted as a colony. You may have also talked about how the Cuban people were subjected to Spanish laws despite the fact that they didn't live in Spain. Let's take a little deeper look at this relationship between Spain and Cuba. Since the times of Christopher Columbus, Cuba had been heavily influenced by European countries, and most of that control was coming from Spain. However, by the late 1800s, Spain was starting to lose control over Cuba, as well as its other colonies around the world. Spain was growing weaker, and many of its colonies saw an opportunity to gain independence from its imperialistic leader. In an attempt to gain complete independence, Cuban revolutionaries led a series of rebellions in 1868 and 1878. Unfortunately, the Cubans, both of these rebellions, failed and Spain continued to control Cuba. Meanwhile, since the mid-1800s, the United States had been sitting back, watching these failed rebellions play out in Cuba and continuing to successfully trade goods with Cuba. Many Americans had an interest in annexing or adding Cuba into their empire. The opportunity that these Americans had been waiting for occurred in 1895 when a Cuban nationalist named Jose Marti led a revolution for Cuba. Marti was a Cuban revolutionary who had been exiled from Cuba by the Spanish to the United States, where he became a journalist who wrote about the evils of Spain and the struggles of Cuba. Marti believed that this revolution would be one that succeeded because he was gathering support from the United States through his journalism. Some Americans viewed the Cuban Revolution as a repeat of the struggle they had experienced 100 years earlier in the American Revolution. In other words, the United States sympathized with Cuba because they could relate to the struggle of being a nation forced to fight for independence against a European powerhouse. In the American Revolution, that powerhouse was England, and now it was Spain for the Cubans. As the revolution plays out in Cuba, Spanish property and goods were destroyed by Cuban revolutionaries. These Cuban revolutionaries used the phrase Cuba Libre, or Free Cuba, as a rallying call against Spain. All the while, the United States was sitting back trying to decide whether to get involved or not. The American people were split on whether or not to get involved in Cuban Revolution. Some believed that the United States should not get involved and instead maintain their peaceful relationship with Spain. They claimed that the Cuban Revolution did not involve the United States, and so getting involved was not needed, simply because it wasn't any of their business. In other words, the United States was not being directly threatened, and therefore it wasn't their battle to fight. On the other hand, some Americans believed that it was their responsibility to help the Cubans fight against imperialistic control from Spain. However, many supporters of American involvement weren't interested in helping Cuba, but instead in establishing influence and control over the small nation island. In other words, some Americans wanted to become the empire that controlled Cuba as a colony. To hide this imperialistic message, they claimed to be helping Cuba fight a similar revolution to the one that they had fought 100 years earlier in the American Revolution. For supporters going to war, the challenge was finding a way to gather support from the American public. Before we move on, I would like you to respond to the following poll question. Which side would you be on? Would you choose to not go to war with Spain? Or would you choose to go to war with Spain either to help the Cubans or to attempt to establish similar control over Cuba? For many Americans, at least early on, they decided that war with Spain was not needed. Those American imperialists who wanted to expand the American empire and take control of Cuba knew that they would have to sway the minds of the public to support going to war with Spain. The Americans who wanted war with Spain would use yellow journalism to sway the minds of the public. This headline, "Destruction of the Warship Maine was the work of an enemy," is an example of yellow journalism. Before we talk about this in more detail, please respond to the following question. Destruction of the Maine warship. Maine was the work of an enemy. What do you notice about this headline? Take a few seconds to reflect on your response. Hopefully the first thing you notice is that the headline was printed in all caps, an immediate grab at your attention. You should have also noticed that the headline includes words that also pull your attention. Destruction, enemy, for example. As an American reading this, you would be concerned that an American warship was destroyed. You may wonder how many Americans lost their lives on the sinking of that ship, the USS Maine, and that might make you really angry. Many Americans might have felt this same way, and they would be united against this enemy who destroyed one of their ships. You'd read the article, which revealed that Spain was responsible, and as a good American citizen, you would be furious at Spain and wouldn't forget those feelings anytime soon. The newspaper article has successfully swayed your opinion, but perhaps the facts being presented weren't as accurate as you first thought. And that was the point of yellow journalism, to create an emotional reaction that would be used against Spain. The ultimate goal of yellow journalism is simply to grab attention and sway people's opinions, not report the most accurate facts they could find. So if you were an author of a piece of yellow journalism, you wouldn't focus on reporting factual evidence, but instead on getting attention and persuading people to believe what you are telling them. During this time period, 1895 to 1898, many imperialistic Americans called jingoists used yellow journalism to gather public support for going to war with Spain. In the case of the Spanish-American War, a jingoist was an aggressive American imperialist who desired to profit and expand American influence over Cuba. Jingoists supported yellow journalism because it was being used in a way that gathered support for their ultimate goal, to go to war and gain control over Cuba. Let's take another look at the headline we looked at earlier. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. This is a fantastic example of not just yellow journalism, but also of a primary resource. A primary resource is a document that comes directly from the time period being studied. Since we are studying the Spanish-American War, the newspaper qualifies as a primary source because it was published during the Spanish-American War era. Historians interpret primary resources and use their findings to form new explanations about history. In this case, the headline of this article suggests that yellow journalism was used to sway public opinion. The USS Maine was an American warship that was stationed in Cuban harbors that experienced an explosion and sank. Many Americans were killed when the USS Maine sunk. Jingoists saw the sinking of the USS Maine as the best opportunity to gather American support using yellow journalism. Newspapers were published claiming that the Spanish were responsible for the sinking of the USS Maine, and that the war was needed to make sure that those who died weren't lost in vain. The articles may not have been true or based on fact, but many Americans didn't know any better and decided that war with Spain was now necessary in 1898, 3 years after the start of the Cuban Revolution. In fact, a war cry, "Remember the Maine," to hell with Spain, was often used as a rallying cry against Spain. Historians today believe that the sinking of the USS Maine was simply due to an explosion caused by machinery failure, not an attack by the Spanish. Yellow journalists wouldn't report that interpretation, though, because they knew they could gather public support through emotional reaction by blaming Spain. Either way, jingoists got what they wanted, as the majority of the American public now supported going to war with Spain. Yellow journalism had been a success for the jingoists, and many Americans now supported going to war with Spain in order to avenge those who had lost their lives in the sinking of the USS Maine. With the American public swayed, President William McKinley had no choice but to ask Congress to declare war on Spain to avoid political ridicule. In April of 1898, the United States declared war on Spain and became an official supporter of the Cuban Revolution. However, some Americans recognized the true intentions of jingoists and yellow journalists to gather control over Cuba and expand the American empire. Some Cuban journalists also realized the interests of jingoists, and they decided to print political cartoons such as this, depicting the relationship between the United States and Cuba. Take a look at this picture. What do you notice? How does this image make the United States look? Respond to the following prompt. What does this political cartoon say about the interests of the United States? Take a few seconds to reflect on your response. Hopefully you decided that this makes the United States look selfish against Cuba, as Uncle Sam is menacingly looking at Cuba and attempting to scoop it up, symbolizing an attempt to take control. The United States is portrayed negatively here, and one can infer that the United States is acting only out of self-interest and not to help Cuba. This portrayal shows the United States as just another empire using imperialism to take control, not as a friendly supporter of Cuban independence. One of the final cementing factors that caused the Spanish-American War came from a book that was gathering a lot of attention in the United States. The book was written by Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan in 1890 and was called Influence of Sea Power on History. The book analyzed the British Empire and argued that the success of England was due to the fact that they had established a powerful navy with bases all over the world. This convinced many Americans that they could become just as powerful as the British if they too established a powerful navy and naval bases across the globe. The American empire would continue to grow if they used the same model as England. The Cuban Revolution was an opportunity to work towards that goal, and by defeating Spain in war, they could establish a naval base within Cuba. A war with Spain would also give the United States an opportunity to establish other bases in Spanish colonies across the globe, such as in the Philippines. This book had a powerful influence over the minds of many Americans and was certainly a cause of the Spanish American War. We know this because after the war, the United States established naval bases in former Spanish colonies, the most famous of them being Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. To sum up this lesson, these 4 points should be considered review at this point, as we have covered them all in this lesson. The first reason was the idea of creating an American empire established through imperialism. The United States saw the Cuban Revolution as an opportunity to establish control and influence over Cuba and expand the American empire. These feelings were heavily influenced by Mayans' influence of sea power on history, because it outlined a model that Americans could use to establish naval power throughout the world. The second reason was the impact of yellow journalism on the American public. Yellow journalism, again, focused on grabbing attention and swaying public opinion, not necessarily reporting accurate facts. The flashy headlines worked, and many Americans viewed Spain as the enemy. The third reason was established through yellow journalism, and that reason was the American public's perception of the sinking of the USS Maine. The American public, because of yellow journalism, believed the USS Maine's sinking was not an accident, but instead a planned attack from Spain. This again helped gather public support of declaring a war on Spain. The fourth and final cause of the Spanish-American War was the role of jingoists, or the extreme American imperialists who wanted to establish an American empire that dominated the globe. Jingoists were the ones who led the charge by strongly pushing for war through manipulation of the minds of many Americans. Overall, these 4 factors were the most important causes of the Spanish-American War. This brings us to the end of the lesson on the cause of the Spanish-American War. Thank you for completing this lesson and answering the questions through Play Post-it. Tomorrow when you come to school, you're going to be tested on this information. You will first be asked to write an article that outlines the 4 main reasons for the Spanish-American War. Then you will be taking a multiple choice test that covers the information we discussed in the lesson. Feel free to take some time to review your notes and jot down any questions that you still have. I will start class tomorrow by answering any questions that you still have. Thanks, and we'll see you tomorrow.